comes across as something else when somebody sees it at first.
Sure. So, of course, there's going to be at least some set of people who are going to be convinced by moral arguments, and there's going to be another subset of people who aren't convinced by moral arguments. I don't think we should figure out a win condition based off of whether you and I are convinced, but just whether how well we present our arguments as
Yeah.
convincing or not. What I'm going to say is that the common stock arguments that veganism uses are a lot less convincing than they are on first appearances. So I'm going to allow you to pick arguments that you think are convincing, and I'm going to show why I don't think they're as convincing as they initially appear.
Okay, well, that seems like a
What is
different claim to saying they're not convincing at all, right? Because they could still have some level of being convincing, right?
Well, if they're not convincing in a way to convert someone over to veganism, then they're not convincing enough. If somebody says, that's interesting, that's not really the metric we're looking for. Do you think that's fair?
Okay, so how would you determine if an argument is convincing or not? If
Well,
it
I think
makes
we're
them go
simply going to
vegan?
have to. No, well, I mean, we can say that, yeah, theoretically, it would lead someone to want to transition over to veganism.
And you think that if you discuss the argument with them, then they would not go vegan?
Yeah, I think I would make them seem much less convinced to go vegan, and they would likely choose not to go vegan. That the average person would choose not to go vegan over going vegan.
Okay. Well, I think that the purpose of any vegan moral argument that you could present would just be to essentially show what values they already have, unless you're trying to come up with some objective moral claim, which I wouldn't agree with. So all that you're really doing is showing them that they already have these values, and I don't understand how you can analyze the argument with them and walk through why it's not as convincing as it seems, and then it still not convince them because they still hold those values.
Well, you have to make the claim that they do, in fact, have those values that lead to veganism. My opposition will be that no, they don't.
Okay, so the values would be assumably that they don't want to kill animals or exploit them.
Yeah.
And you
So we
think
can
that
either
people are
look,
okay with this?
yeah.
Okay.
So that's the proposition that people would be able to talk about killing and eating animals in some scenario and be okay with it. So you would agree that on a very basic level, what veganism is going to be a complete abstaining of killing and eating animals for food. And we can put in the whole if it's not necessary for your life
Yeah, I
condition,
guess under most circumstances.
right? Yeah, under most circumstances.
So, what if you made an argument against supporting factory farms, and this logically leads to veganism in most cases? Would that still be an argument for veganism?
No, because I think welfareism is another position that's also opposed to factory farming conditions, and it's also a non-vegan position. So I can make the
Mm-hmm.
case that welfareism is more convincing than is veganism. Veganism requires
Mm-hmm.
complete abstinence, not just being against a particular form of creating meat.
Right, but I'm saying if the argument against the factory farms logically led to veganism, would it still be an argument for veganism? Because I think it would be.
If it logically led to veganism, as in it
Yeah,
can't lead to welfareism,
under most circumstances.
I don't know what you mean by under most circumstances.
So
If you present an
let's
argument
say
that can't lead to welfareism, but has to lead to veganism instead, then absolutely that's an argument in your favor.
no, I'm saying if you made an argument for welfareism, and in
Uh-huh.
most cases this entails going vegan, I would still consider that an argument for going vegan.
Sure. No, my welfarist arguments will be limited to ones that are minimally non-vegan.
So if we made an argument I think most people would agree with welfareism, so it's not about the vegan values. And we say that this is what is the easiest and most sustainable thing to do, and not a lot of people can actually uh, do the other option, which would be supporting small farms or farms that don't use these practices that people are against. And it would be more expensive. So it's harder to follow unless people can actually follow it. So it would still lead to veganism if it's just a welfareist view under most
If your view
circumstances.
is that what veganism is purely action based and not at all an ethical position, you might be able to argue for that case. But I wouldn't say that that's what veganism is. Veganism isn't just the fact that you don't eat meat, it's that you're taking an ethical position against eating meat. So even if it were the case that someone found themselves eating plant-based because they weren't able to find any ethically sourced meat, that would not make them a vegan.
Well, I think that most vegans would agree that vegans are like a branch of vegans, but they eat meat, right?
Yeah, but that's because they're ethically okay with the idea of roadkill and whatnot. I'm advocating a position where you are ethically okay with raising animals in particular conditions, killing them, and eating them for food. Now, whether or not those conditions are available, they still would hold the ethical commitment that it's still okay to do that. Whether or not they're able to is besides the point.
Yeah, but it still comes to a different definition of veganism because if they're okay with eating meat, because we initially started with the complete abstinence of eating meat or animal products, right? So we're going to have to redefine it.
Sure, sure. We can put in like the usual caveats for veganism. Like I agree with you that there are forms of freeganism where you just stumble upon some dead animal that you're ethically okay with eating it. Because generally what veganism stands in opposition to is the killing the animal to eat it. And generally and they would also make the concession that if you had to, you had no other choice. You could kill and eat the animal. But other than those general normal caveats, I'm advocating a position outside of that that is minimally non-vegan.
Okay, so I think there's like two ways we can go about this. So one of them would just be arguing about how many people actually hold the strictly vegan ethical views. And I guess we would have to try and find some sort of statistics on that. And then the other would just be like, let me think again.
Sorry, that,
How we're like defining veganism, because I've heard some vegans say that they're okay with certain methods of getting meat. So, for example, like grass-fed farms, and I've had them say they're okay with that. So I'm not sure if the vegan position actually doesn't encompass these practices, but they just choose to not
well,
support them themselves.
I'm going to say that if you think that grass-fed, farm-raised animals slaughtered and killed for meat and then fed to people is vegan, then you haven't debated very many vegans.
I'm not necessarily saying it is vegan. I'm just saying that from what I can tell, a lot of vegans are actually okay with this.
Okay, then you're absolutely wrong. I mean, any vegans in the chat want to chime in and say whether or
Yeah,
not
well,
that
of
is an
course,
ethical position of veganism. Go ahead.
that isn't going to like prove anything. I doubt either of us have statistics on that. But either way, it's just going to come
Well,
down
would
to
you
the
like to tell me
statistics.
where your claim comes from? Like you seem to think
Based
that
on
most
my,
people would do this.
I'm not sure if it would be most people. Based on my interactions with vegans, I've noticed that a lot of them are okay with certain practices of getting meat, even if it involves killing the animal. Um, but either way, if we're going to go down that route or the route of seeing what beliefs people hold, we're going to need some sort of statistic. And I'm not sure how we'd get this, but
Okay,
what
well,
I
all
do
I can
know
really
is
say
that
is that if that's the view you're defending, then you not had very limited experience in
yeah,
vegan
but
argumentations.
we
I've
don't
been
have to go
doing
down
debates
that
against
route.
vegans for like 2.5 years now, and I can tell you that your view of a definition of what a vegan is completely substandard. Like
Yeah,
I
well,
wouldn't
we
find
can
one out of
also
a
go down
thousand.
another route. That's fine. That's fine. We don't have to go down that. It's just we're going to have to find some way of determining whether people do hold vegan values or not.
Well, of course, but but the thing that I'm more interested in is you presenting cases of what you think are very convincing arguments, and then we can have a conversation on whether or not those are actually convincing. But first, this is going to be a big issue, is what you think veganism is.
Yeah,
Now,
it's fine. I've
one
already
of
said that I won't go by that definition because
so
it's
one of my
just
first
based on.
points against veganism is that veganism has trouble defining itself. And I would say that this is one of the reasons is because it has very vague and shaky normative claims attached to the position. Whereas then almost all vegans would agree that killing and raising and killing and eating an animal outside of necessity is wrong. There's really
Mhm.
no unifying normative structure in order to get you there. And any definition that veganism has put out has had a counter argument to it. So one of the most common ones is the vegan society definition, where you don't exploit animals as far as possible and practical, but on examination, possible and practical aren't very limiting circumstances,
Mhm.
right? The things that are possible in ways to abstain from killing animals are immense, and most vegans aren't really willing to do that. So the most common definition of veganism isn't even followed by vegans.
Yeah, I mean, we can go by it's the abstinence of supporting any like type of killing of animals. So whether that's through like buying clothing that supports this or your food choices, we could go by this definition, I guess.
Sure, sure. And that's what I'm happy to start with, because
Yeah.
one of my points against veganism is that if it has no normative structure and it's just specifically targeting resource acquisition from animals, then that's going to seem a lot more arbitrary than a normative structure that's based off perhaps utilitarian instincts or rights-based,
Mm-hmm.
variants. If it's just like I don't like the specific action, it's going to seem a lot less convincing than a normative structure which underpins it.
Why would that necessarily be less convincing if the majority of the population holds those values?
The value of a very specific action with animals without reference to any other animal ethics. You're asking me why
Mm,
that would be less convincing?
I mean, the
I guess
value
I
that
would
was.
say that any particular ethical statement that has incredible specificity is always less convincing than one that seems to be broadly applicable and follow common intuitions.
I would say not necessarily if everybody holds to the hyper specific like argument and values.
Yeah, okay, if everybody does, but if we take the whole of
Exactly.
society, people don't, right? So
Wait,
generally, the way
are we doing
veganism is argued
society in
for is
Western
using basic
countries?
premises. What's that?
Are we doing society as in just Western society or
I think
the
we said that
global
in the beginning.
population?
I mean, we can talk about
Yeah.
other
I just wanted to
societies
clarify
broadly.
again now because
I
I would
mean,
only be wanting to speak about Western societies.
yeah. I mean, I don't think it really changes much if we open it up. We're going to find countries that have a higher veganism percentage, but none of them are more vegan than non-vegan.
Right, but like I think we can infer from other things that people do actually hold the values that killing an animal is wrong. Like even vegetarians do this because then, even though they are, because the definition we're going by is like killing an animal for resources, right? So that would
Well, I
encompass
mean,
vegetarians.
you know what? You're absolutely right. We should probably include the fact that veganism is also an abstinence from resources collected from an animal that aren't requiring killing, because vegans are opposed to milk, honey, eggs, and anything that they consider exploitative,
Okay,
which
so
they,
now it is including exploitation rather than just the deaths of animals, like not necessarily deaths, but causing deaths, right?
yeah. And you would agree that that's the vegan stance, right?
Okay, yeah, but I would also agree that most people think that it is wrong to exploit animals.
Okay, go ahead and make your case.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason that most people aren't actually taking action is just due to ignorance and not being aware of the exploitation that's going on and not being aware that they're actually against the practices because they just are ignorant to the subject. And this is why you get so
Ignorant.
many people like going vegetarian and stuff because they are horrified by animals being killed for meat and stuff, but they're not aware of the exploitation that goes on in like the dairy and egg industries.
Uh-huh. Well, I think what would be more likely is that people are ignorant to the suffering aspects and to the horrible treatment aspects, and that most people's opposition is to those aspects, which the welfarist stance also takes into consideration. So, if you want to say that people are just ignorant that animals die in order to eat meat, that basic level, I would say that you're
Well,
probably wrong on that aspect, that
well,
people
how
do
how are we
understand.
defining exploitation?
Well, that's a good question, right? Like this is for the vegan to be able to define so that we could always understand what they mean by exploitation. I've never really heard a normative structure put forth by veganism that clear cuts put things into categories so that we can understand it. Do you think that there is some sort of definition within veganism that defines exploitation clearly?
I'm not sure to be honest, but I
Right.
think
So
that
then again, it's just a set of actions.
I think that even if you don't define it, like to most people's understanding of the word exploitation, they would just be against it.
Yeah, I would agree that most people would think that exploitation, but whether or not they consider getting milk from a cow or eggs from a chicken as exploitation is clearly debatable.
Hmm. Well, I guess I would just argue that if they see the industry's methodology of getting these things, well, I guess you're going to bring that back to welfareism, but we're
Yeah,
including that as part of veganism right now because we're just adding that on to just deaths. Then they're going to be against it.
they're going to be against what?
The exploitation aspect. And then we can just say, okay, most people are against exploitation, and then we can just talk about the animal deaths again.
Yeah, so that's your case to make is that the animal death part is that we can move out of welfareism with people's values into complete veganism. Now, what underpins the idea that people hold values that wouldn't accept welfareism and must move to veganism?
Well, I mean, I don't see why that would necessarily follow. You could infer that because most people are against suffering, all we have to do is prove that most people are also against the killing of animals, which I think we can do. Because this is why
Oh,
when so many
if you
people,
feel like we can do it, do it.
yeah, I mean, when there's been like experimentation, um, and people have seen animals being killed in front of them, they've just had a moral reaction to that where they think that is morally wrong and they're also disgusted by it. So they are against the killing of it, I would say. And I would think this applies to most people because most people have this reaction. And I'm trying to think of like cases where they've experimented with this by exposing people to the killing of animals.
For what purpose are we talking about? Like, if I showed someone a film of people killing a goat for food, you're expecting that the average person is going to have an adverse moral reaction. Not just an adverse reaction, not just like, oh, that's gory and scary, but an actual moral, this is wrong.
Yeah, but I was actually thinking more of real life situations where they would be in front of the animal being killed.
Sure. Now, what
Yeah.
makes you say that people would have this sort of moral reaction?
Uh, Based on what they say after they see it. They
Is this
say,
like
"Oh, that is wrong," for example.
is this something that you like demonstrate, or is just something you intuit is the case?
I think I could demonstrate it, but I would need time to look for actual data
Right.
because I don't have links ready for this. But I think there has been experimentation where they've killed animals in front of people, or like tried to make them do it themselves for the purpose of food, and they have said that it is wrong, and they have a moral reaction to it.
I mean, if you have some sort of empirical study that would bolster your position, I'm fine with that. But if you want to argue more from intuitions, do you have anything else other than I think people would have this reaction? Like, do you think that there is any actual normative structure that people find intuitively plausible that would lead them to veganism?
Well, I just think they would see killing of animals as wrong, and I think we already agreed that most people see exploitation as wrong, so that would lead them logically to veganism.
How would it lead them logically to veganism? We haven't actually established whether or not people consider certain acts exploitative or not.
Like just taking milk from a cow.
Yeah.
Mm. Then I
Do,
have to
do
think
I
about
can
that for a
offer you
second.
arguments why I think it's not. I mean, in lieu of you not offering any arguments that it is, I'll go ahead and go on the offensive here.
Okay.
Okay. Well, generally, animals live in a state of nature where they have particular utilitarian standards that we would expect their lives to have,
Hmm.
right? So, they're going to have to deal with possible starvation, food hungers, disease. If we talk about that in comparison to a possible welfare standard farm, we can actually improve upon utilitarian standards, right?
Hmm.
So we can actually make sure that they're closed, fed, protected, and not not have disease. Yes, I see you, deontologist.
Do you
Uh,
think that most
so that their
people hold to
utilitarian lives are
utilitarian
better.
normative systems?
What's that?
Do you think that most people hold to utilitarian normative systems?
I think that a lot of people, at least in part, have utilitarianism as part of their system. Whether or not it's the
Yeah, just
entire
part.
system, I don't think so. But it's usually a part of moral evaluations. And when it comes to animals, there's a lot less to discuss because of the types of beings that they are. I would say that utilitarianism encompasses most of what is good or bad for an animal. And I also think it's the case that when we do a good welfare farm, we can increase the standards of utilitarian standards.
Yeah, but I know some people still see this as wrong, but I don't know the percentage, and I'm not aware of any statistics on this, so I cannot say whether or not it would be a quote unquote convincing argument by the metrics that we determine this. But I do know that people are convinced by vegan arguments, and I'm not sure if you posing your objections to the arguments would change whether or not they are convinced by them.
Okay, well, on one hand, we have my argument of why I think it's less convincing. On the other hand, we have your assertion that people feel that a certain way. We can move on to other criticisms that I have.
Yeah, I guess that's some of your criticisms of certain arguments. For example, the most common vegan argument, name the trait, and why you think that your criticisms would mean people are not convinced to go vegan. Because on a base level, we can say that people have been convinced by that argument, a relatively high
Yeah.
percentage.
What do you mean a relatively high percentage?
I'm
Is
not
there some
sure
way
what the
that you
percentage would
calculate that?
be. That this is just my intuition tells me that a lot of people have been convinced by it, and I would consider it convincing on that metric.
That this idea that if you can't name a trait, that you should therefore be vegan.
Well, it would just be looking at their values, essentially. That's the point of the argument, to see if they do hold to values that would logically entail going vegan or not.
But that's not necessarily what name the trait does. In fact, a lot of people are convinced by name the trait simply on the basis that they can't figure out what their normative structure actually is. And so they just default to veganism because people are convinced that veganism has a normative structure which is consistent, not that that's ever been demonstrated.
Okay, what is your justification for that belief?
Well, I mean, talks with people like Dr. Abbey, who says all he cares about is consistency, that he doesn't actually care about animals. He feels no emotional suffering when watching animals. There's this large narrative of people who are believers of Name the Trait who don't actually state that they care about animals. Um, but what they care about is consistency, and they can't figure out how to be consistent in non-veganism. However, the
Well,
problem
that's just a
is
cute
I'm
example.
unaware of anybody who's managed to be consistent with veganism either. So unless you can present some sort of normative structure that actually is consistent within veganism, I have no reason to believe that people's inability to name traits is relevant at all.
Well, I think that it's not just their inability to name traits, and they just do hold to the values that would lead to veganism, and they see the exploitation as bad.
If somebody already held the value of I don't want to kill animals, this is bad, what do they need to go about naming traits for? It would just be a wasted effort of a thing to do because
I
they would
guess I would
already know
just
they're
say,
vegan.
that they were ignorant before, and they never really thought about it.
So what is it that name the trait elucidates for people? Their values or the fact that they just
Yeah,
don't have a consistent structure? Because as has been described, NTT is a consistency test. It's not a these are the values you have test. It's can I be consistent within non-veganism? Can I survive the reductios from the traits I'm able to describe?
well, not necessarily. I think that some people would see that their values align with veganism through name the trait, and not necessarily just see their current normative system is inconsistent and not know how to make it consistent.
Have
But
you encountered name the trait? Have you run through it?
yes,
Right. Do you know that it's described as a consistency test?
sometimes it is, I guess. But
Right.
I
Well,
think the
that would be the
purpose can
entire point of
be
it,
to show your values still.
right? And generally, people are very bad at describing their own normative start or what motivates them morally. So
Yeah,
a
I
lot of the
guess it just comes down to I would have to try and find some sort of statistic for people's moral beliefs, but I don't know how we would look for those because obviously everybody is going to default to veganism if they just can't justify their own normative systems and they
so
don't
why do
want
you
to be
think people would
inconsistent.
default to veganism? Why not default to non-vegan?
If they feel that they're being inconsistent and want to be consistent,
Do you think
then
somebody who is unable to be consistent as a vegan and give a consistent normative structure as a vegan should default back to non-veganism?
wait, what was that? Sorry.
Do you think somebody who is a vegan and is unable to give a consistent normative structure within veganism should default back to non-veganism?
Not necessarily.
So don't you think that's a double standard?
That's not what the point I'm trying to make is. I'm just saying we need some sort of statistic for people's values, and to do that, we would need to run them through your argumentation against the arguments that convinced them to go vegan in the first place. Um,
Right. Well,
so
we
we
know we're
could
not going
like
to do
say
the statistical
people who
analysis in
actually,
this chat,
yeah,
right?
right. So I
I
don't
want
think
you to give
anything there is
convincing
reliable.
cases. Like if you're going to sit here during this entire
What do
debate
you
and say,
mean
well, we need
convincing
empirical,
cases?
just give me convincing arguments, arguments that you think are convincing. Now, if you think name the
Well, they're
trait
not
is
going to be
convincing,
convincing to you, are they? Because I know that
we've
you
already
have a
established at the
consistent
beginning that the goal is
normative.
not to convince me or you, but to just appeal to the audience's sensibility of what's intuitively convincing. So, do you have arguments that show name the trait is convincing in a way that isn't like a double standard?
I know there could be vegan arguments that would be convincing to people with those values. I just don't know the percentage of people with those values, and I don't see where we can go from here without somehow finding
If
these
you're not really
percentages.
willing to give argumentation for veganism, I'm not sure why you accepted this debate. But we can talk
Well,
about name the trait
you were
continuously. I
talking
can
about the
say that I
convincing
have
aspect of it.
structures, I have answers to name the trait, which are so far
Yeah,
undefeated.
I know you have answers to them, but that's just your position, and we're not
It is
talking
my
about
position.
convincing you.
Sure.
Right, they're based on your values. So to determine whether or not an argument is convincing, it would just be dependent upon the person's values. So I think we would, in order to move forward, have to find some percentage of people that actually hold vegan values. And I don't think that we even have this data.
Why don't you just give me how you theoretically think name the trait would go to elucidate someone's values in order to switch? Like, just talk about how the conversation would work that makes somebody realize, oh, I do in fact value animals.
Well, it could also go in other ways. Basically, they could think, because obviously there's a dialogue tree as well, right?
Mhm.
So you could just be talking to them, and then they realize that, oh, okay, I guess that I do value animals because this is what I value. And even if it's just because they don't know how to justify it, those could actually be their values. I'm not sure if I'm making sense.
I'm not sure what your case is. Like, is this how you think it typically goes? Why do you think name the
No,
trait elucidates this over
I
any
don't
other vegan
see I
conversation?
don't see the point of running name the trait because that's not what the argument is. The argument is if there are convincing vegan arguments, and obviously if they're convincing or not is going to be dependent upon the person's values, um, and if they
Of
align with
course,
veganism.
but
Right, and I don't know if we even have data showing people's values or not.
I'm just curious, Brandon. Are you gonna default to that statement no matter what I say?
I'm just saying I don't think we can move forward from this. Like, and people can just have different intuitive beliefs on whether or not people hold to these values or not.
Like that's your entire position. You took the debate in order to tell me that, and that you don't actually want to present argumentation or talk about my
Well,
argumentation.
why would presenting argumentation matter to your debate proposition?
Because we can give convincing sounding cases to the audience and they can determine whether or not they are plausibly convincing or not.
I think whether or not they're convincing is dependent upon the individual's values.
So
If you
you
just had
really
a
have
simple,
nothing to say on this topic. Is it that's sort of
I
what I'm
think if
getting
you
here.
just gave a simple argument that is something like, if you think it's wrong to kill animals, then logically you should not kill animals. That's an argument to not kill animals, right? And that's just dependent upon you not thinking it's morally permissible to kill animals,
Okay,
right?
sure. So
So I
that's
think
your whole
any
argument is that if people agree that you shouldn't kill animals, then they would logically not want to kill animals. That's all I have. We have no
I'm
empirical
saying that
study. I'm
I'm
done with the
saying
debate. Is that what we're
yeah.
doing?
Let me clarify. I'm saying that any argument I could run is fundamentally going to come down to, do you hold these values or not? Because otherwise, it's not going to lead to veganism. So we would just need some sort of data on this, and I don't think we can move on from here. And I accepted the debate because I disagreed that there are no convincing arguments for veganism, because I think there are,
Okay,
dependent
well,
upon the person's values, and we're determining whether or not it's convincing for the general population, at least in Western countries. So we would need some sort of percentage of people that actually hold vegan values.
okay, well, I'm more looking for somebody who can actually like interact with the common vegan arguments and positions for or against them, or other ways of looking at them in order to elucidate whether they're more or less convincing than they initially seem. That was sort of the point of me doing the debate. And if you're unable to interact in that sort of way, I'd gladly put deontologists on here and we can have a conversation. You can
Sure, you
leave.
can do that. Yeah, I guess I'll just make a closing statement that I think we would need some sort of data. And I think the ontologiologist is going to actually give you an argument that he thinks is convincing, but I still think it would be dependent upon the person who's listening's values.
Cool.
Okay, so are you guys pretty much done?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it just comes down to if it's convincing or not is dependent upon if you hold those values or not. And we don't know how many people hold to those values. And we're trying to talk about if it's convincing to the general Western population. So we would need to know how many people hold to those values. And we don't know this.
Yeah, and more the point, what I wanted to do was actually present
Right.
the
You can
arguments
say
that are
that's what
common
you
and
wanted
talk
to do.
about them.
That's fine. Yeah, I'm sure other people might be willing to do that with you.
Great. Bring them on.
Okay, cool. So what I'll do, I'll post a voting poll for the interaction you guys just had. The audience can vote on who they think performed better in that debate, and then I'll just unmute the onteleologist and he can jump in. Sound good?
Sure, sounds good.